When you don't take time to look at it through other people's eyes. Take some time and reflect on what you believe in your soul. Cause that is the key to life. You gotta let the negativity go.
Hello and welcome to What the Fox podcast with your two hosts, Lindsay Fox and Amber Ross. As a reminder, today's episode is sponsored by therapyappointment.com. In addition, we are also sponsored by conscioushealers.com. Conscious Healers is a consciously connected retreat and coaching center that is really rooted in being divinely inspired and spirit-led. In fact, I will be leading one of those retreats on April 20th in Sedona, Arizona. We invite you to please check us out. It is going to be magical and healing in every way possible. So with that, we are going to dive in right into today's episode. We have an amazing guest speaker with us today, and her name is Hailey Magee. She is a certified coach as well as a writer, and she is most well known for really kicking ass and taking names whenever it comes to boundary setting.
I love it.
Wow, I love that too. Can everyone please introduce me that way?
Yes,
You
from this
bet.
day forward, that is your introduction.
That's the tag. Well, thank you, Lindsay. I'm so stoked to be here with the two of you. This is going to be really fun.
Yeah, Hailey, we're thrilled to have you. Obviously, something that Lindsay and I've talked about a few times in this podcast is, identifying boundaries, talking about like what that could look like in our lives. And today's conversation is kind of designed to take that to that next level and kind of see, what does it really look like? How do you get started? Because like, obviously, are we ripping the Band-Aid off and like one day we have no boundaries, the next day we have 100 boundaries? Like, what are we doing? How do we get started?
Yes, I always use the metaphor of like, it's like if you're learning how to like go running, for example, you're not going to start off with a marathon, right? You're going to start with like little warm-ups and running laps. And I think in our boundary setting, we have to do the same thing. So right there with you.
Yeah, big time. Well, maybe we should start with this then. Hailey, why are setting boundaries so hard for people?
Man, it's a question of the day.
Man,
Right?
you didn't want to start with something easy, did you?
Like it just, because seriously, it's like, think about it, right? I think when you become an expert and really strong at setting boundaries, when you jump into that, it becomes natural. It becomes a really natural flow of things. You get really in flow with the fact that these are your boundaries for yourself. You honor them, and you don't really think much of it to that extent because it becomes like a natural language at that point, like a fluent language. But when you rewind and you go back to the beginning of your healing journey, long before those boundaries existed, when you rewind, it's like, why was it so hard in the first place to learn how to set those boundaries?
Yes, I distinctly remember feeling for so long like there was some sort of barrier between like the words I wanted to say and my mouth. It's like there was an obstacle. I could not in those moments like say no or set a boundary. And I think in my work, I've noticed a few key reasons, and some folks may have like a couple, none, all. But I think one of the big ones is, if our needs have been invalidated in the past, whether it's by a caregiver or a significant other or an institution or a faith, any number of things, I think we slowly internalize the belief that our needs don't matter. And boundaries are just tools we use to protect our needs, right? So why would we bother protecting something we don't think is worth protecting? That's one big reason. Also, a lot of folks who have experienced trauma may develop like the fawn response or learned helplessness, where we kind of learn that we can't control our external world. So what we try to do is control whether or not we have needs at all, which is hard because of course we have them.
Yeah.
Beautifully stated.
Yeah.
Beautifully stated.
And one
it is so hard. Yeah, go ahead.
Oh, I'm sorry. I just wanted to make sure. And I think it's so important to also talk about like oppression and systemic barriers to boundary setting too. Like for folks who have been marginalized in our culture or don't have as much social power, it's harder to set boundaries. Like if I'm in like a difficult financial situation, for example, it's going to be pretty darn hard for me to set a firm boundary with my boss because I need that job to be okay.
Yeah. I'm so glad that you're bringing that piece up, because that's something that I'm not sure what episodes, if any, that you've listened to with us in the past, but if something that we do kind of keep keep going with like kind of a pattern or a theme, is the fact that the systemic oppression is very real in every single facet of life, particularly when you are a vulnerable population in need. And so we are often taught in those roles or those individuals to not speak up, to not have a voice.
Yep.
Absolutely.
No, go ahead, Hailey.
Oh no, Amber, please, I would love to hear your thoughts on this. I've talked a lot already.
No, I think it's something that can be overlooked a lot of times. It's something that people maybe are afraid to bring up, to say like, hey, this is something that's not being talked about. So I'm grateful that you rounded out your kind of assessment or your big three with one that doesn't get talked about enough.
Yeah, it's so, and we can't not, like, I think that's one of my biggest personal frustrations with things like social media or spaces that encourage us to be quippy and simple, is that a lot of voices get left out in that. And but it's so important, you know? So yeah, we have to talk about that. And every different community or different identity group faces different barriers to this stuff, no doubt.
100%. And I think that a part of this ties exactly back to what you were just mentioning about the fact that boundaries teach people how to treat us. And if we are used to being treated in a certain kind of a way, we're probably not going to have really great boundaries. If we're used to being treated like crap, or that's how we were taught or whatever through a toxic relationship or your family of origin upbringing or trauma, whatever the case, we kind of flub with the boundary side of things because it's never really been role modeled to us. It hasn't been taught, and we haven't really thought that we're worthy to do it. So it's so easy, I think, with pop psychology and insta therapy on Instagram or whatever, to have all of these like bulleted points of what you should be doing and how easy it is to say no.
Oh my gosh, it's not easy at all. Whoever's saying that, shut up. Like, stop. Stop.
Get out.
It's not, get out of here with that nonsense.
Right?
I think
it's really blasphemy. It's There's
Lindsay,
so much
before
more
we
there. Yeah, go ahead.
Before we dive into that, I want to provide like an alternative approach to what you just said, because for years I struggled with boundaries, because in my mind, a boundary was something I was setting to tell somebody else how to treat me. And like that, it was a barrier for me because I'm like, it's not my job to tell you how to treat me. Like, what my job is and what my boundary does for me is satisfy and say, Amber, if you are not being treated this way, or if this thing is not being met, you exit. You like exit stage left. I'm not going to be present in this anymore. It's not, because the other way of thinking in my brain was like, oh, Amber, like you can't control other people. Like that's a whole level of, shenanigans that we're not going to stress ourselves out with. So I couldn't set a boundary because I'm like, well, like shit, I can't control what everybody else does, but I can control what I do. I can control what tables I choose to sit at and what I allow myself to participate in. And that was a pivotal moment for me in boundary setting. And it's something that, Lindsay, last year I did like a massive boundary setting that was like, I'm going to allow myself to decline invitations to things. Like, who?
Yeah.
Like, who knew? It sounds really simple. And when I put it like that, people kind of look at me like I've grown a second head. But like being the people pleaser, yes, being the one who's like, oh my gosh, somebody needs me. Like they want me around. Like that doesn't mean that you have to be there. Sometimes other things come up and you have to take care of yourself first. So that I just wanted to like insert that caveat.
I see that. Like, first of all, kudos, because I know that like, I remember for me, I always tell this story of like, I had a partner who wanted to go to like burrito place A, and I still remember all the courage it took for me to say, I'd actually prefer to go to burrito place B. And it was, from the outside, you'd look at that and you'd think it was just a normal conversation. But in my heart, I was like, I did the thing. Like, I did the thing. So proud. So I get that. And then also I think something you touched on, Amber, that I wanted to like underline is kind of like this really fundamental difference between requests and boundaries. Because for me, understanding that truthfully like rocked my world, because there is a truth to the idea that we can't control other people. I think like a request is when we ask someone else to change their behavior to meet our needs. And that's like a really valid thing to do, especially in relationships where there's a lot of trust and intimacy. But their requests are fundamentally unenforceable because we can't make someone change.
Yeah.
We can ask them, but whatever. Whereas boundaries, exactly like you said, are when we say, it's about us. It's saying, what am I willing or not willing to tolerate? And if it's not tolerable, how can I remove myself from it? And so boundaries are like fundamentally enforceable. And I think that distinction, I don't know, I just find it really important and interesting.
Oh, yeah. I mean, that is some powerful stuff right there, because that's just it. Usually when, at least I would say on the surface level, and whenever I was a beginner at setting boundaries, I really thought of boundaries as a way to control others.
Same.
And it's like I couldn't have been more wrong if I tried. Boundaries isn't about trying to control others. It's about teaching others what I will and will not accept, and if we're a good fit or not. And sometimes we're just not a good fit, and that's okay.
Exactly. Right. Sometimes it's okay. Like this is something I've been talking a lot about online recently too, is this idea that just because I set a boundary with you doesn't make you or your behavior wrong. It just means that it's not a good fit for me right now.
Yeah.
Yes. And this is the same for the same reason I feel like people come and go in our life in a season. You know, it just sometimes it's a good fit in the moment or for that season, and that's wonderful. And maybe there's a falling out or something happens, something goes awry. But at the end of the day, it just the goodness of fit kind of fell apart. Something happened there. And you don't have to have a defining moment to explain it. It's just someone's here and someone's there.
That's right.
And your path is different than mine, and that's okay. We can keep moving. It doesn't have to be about there being a specific instance of trauma, so to speak, or a specific boundary violation. It could just be y'all are on two different paths.
Right. What could be more normal than that? Right. Like mismatch. Like,
Exactly. And I think like we fall prey to this like BFF mentality, even in our adulthood. Like, well, if we're not talking every day and we're not, you know, blah, 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 and we don't hang out 3 times a week and it's not whatever, something's wrong, you know, somebody's mad at me and all of these things. And I feel like that's where boundaries really come into play to say, like, right now, one of the popular things on social media, I don't know if y'all have seen it, is this idea that, you know, you should go quiet and see which one of your friends actually reaches out to you, because those are the ones that actually care about you. Okay. Listen. That is the biggest crock of crap I have seen in a very long time. Like I cannot, I'm like, what sort of toxic garbage are we spewing as adult females to say, you didn't text me, so you don't care about me? Listen, some of us are just trying to tread water and like,
yes. And since when is like putting your, like, this is like testing your relationships. We all know, like, any book on relationships will tell you that putting your partner or putting a friend in a position, like, you're testing their loyalty. Like, what is this, Game of Thrones? Like, we're all adults, like you said, we're treading water.
Little did you know.
Little did you know, surprise. It just, so I bring that up because I feel like oftentimes our boundaries put us in a position where then society latches onto this little thing and tries to create a problem. And I think this is a great example because, you know, say you set a boundary that like, I don't leave my house more than X number of days a week, right? Like it stresses me out. It takes a lot of my energy. And I say like, I'm going to stay home on XYZ day. That's a boundary for me. I don't necessarily like share it broadly and say, I don't leave the house on this day, but you may invite me to something and I may decline. And then I may decline again when you do it. And like after 3 or 4 of those times, there's probably going to be a conversation of like, hey, do you not want to hang out with me? Did something happen? Are we okay?
Yeah.
Which I also think is healthy, but like that's a boundary that I've set. Does not mean that I don't love you. Does not mean that I don't want to hang out. It just means that we need to do a better job of coordinating when it's a goodness of fit or when it's like a good opportunity for our energy. Right?
Yes. And like we can have those conversations. I think that's the thing too, is not being afraid to sit down with a friend or a partner or whoever and just be like, what do we both expect? What do we both need? Where are we both
yes.
at? Because otherwise we fall into this awful pitfall, like the crappy thing you just alluded to, the whole check in with your friends, is like we're expecting mind reading from people, which is not cool and leads to resentment.
Yes.
Totally.
I know for me, like I'm introverted. I actually just realized that this year, after years of thinking I was an extrovert. Really, I was just like a people pleaser trying to fit in. But I think for me, like in the name of polarity, like most of my closest friends are extroverts. And if they had their way, we'd be hanging out most days till 3 a.m., multiple times a day. And it's been a really interesting learning process to set boundaries, kind of like you said, Amber, and like learn to dialogue around how it has nothing to do with them and how I love them immensely, but my social battery is a little bit smaller and like, and sometimes, and that's all right. And sometimes they feel a little hurt by that. And that's also all right. Like, it's just the gray area of all of it.
Yeah. I really appreciate your highlighting of the mind reading aspect because in terms of the cognitive distortion around it, because it really is something that can be something that we unknowingly do. We're unknowingly setting ourselves up to feel that level of resentment because we're mind reading for the other person. There was something that I learned a long time ago as an avid attendee at this time in my life. I used to go to Al-Anon a lot, which is for friends and family members of those with addictions, more specifically alcoholism. And in Al-Anon, I remember them talking a lot about how expectations are premeditated resentments.
Yes.
And boy, I got to tell you, when I first heard that, it just blew my whole world up. I was like, oh my gosh. Expectations are premeditated resentments. And I'm thinking all those people that in my head at this time in my life, I could be so self-righteous of who they should have shown up. They should have done this differently. They should have they should have known I felt this way. They should have known that I needed this thing. And when I remember sitting in one of those group meetings, and when I heard that, I said, damn, I am a part of the problem. I am a part of my own problem.
Yep.
Like, would you look at that?
It's a light bulb moment, isn't it? When it's like, because until then you feel very much a victim of others' behavior and choices. And to recognize that, like, and not only the cool part about realizing I'm part of the problem is that I can be part of the solution.
Yes.
I have autonomy over stating my needs. And
how empowering is that? I mean, really, it was one of those moments where like I felt like I got kicked down to the ground, like, damn, that hurt. But then I'm like, you know what? I'm empowered enough to get up and teach myself how to undo this way of being. And then, to have that sense of agency was really life-changing in a lot of ways. Learning that I can say no, and that no is a complete sentence, and it's within my right to use that word. Is just it sounds so simple, but it is so hard to get the mindset there behind the scenes to bring us forward to having it as like a natural language and way of living.
Completely. And I think part of making that more natural, or something that has assisted me and folks I work with in terms of like removing some of the guilt around that, like being like, my needs matter, I should speak to them, is that, at least in my experience, like not only does being clear about your expectations and needs obviously benefit you for obvious reasons, it benefits the people you're close to, because then they're not sitting there wondering, oh, why is Lindsay ignoring me? Or why is Amber not texting me back? Like, we eliminate a ton of confusion and, again, premeditated resentments when we communicate clearly, generally speaking.
Absolutely.
I agree. And I'd like to like take that down a layer to ask you, like, in your professional opinion, as somebody who does this and who like has done a lot of learning, what does that look like? Like, what are effective ways for me to communicate with, people in my life, to be able to share those boundaries in a way that I'm not saying you messed up, you did this thing, so I did this thing, and like take the blame game out of it and just have an adult like healthy conversation about boundaries?
That's such a good question because it's easy. It's so
Oh.
slippery slope to fall into that, or easy to fall into
I
the
was gonna say
blaming.
it's easy.
So easy, it's hard.
Hailey, tell me all the things.
Make it easy for us.
Right? But I feel like in my experience, it really helps. This sounds simple, but really focusing on I statements has been imperative, right?
Mhm.
So I feel such and such way. With the introversion, I need more alone time than the average Joe. I need social recharge time. Or, so really focusing on our own feelings, our own needs, and also opening up the dialogue. I think something that I don't like about a lot of boundary setting discourse is this like implicit assumption that you have to go into these conversations ready to say no and stand up for yourself, like fearless. And that doesn't align with a lot of our realities, especially recovering people pleasers, because we're like, I'm nervous. I am afraid of hurting their feelings. I care about them. This might hurt them. And so in the beginning, I encourage what I call like a radically transparent approach to boundary setting. So what that means is like going into it, owning that it may be uncomfortable. So I might say like, Amber, like I really care about you and I'm afraid of hurting your feelings. But I want our relationship to be a place where we can be honest with each other. So I need to tell you that such and such.
Yeah.
And that's a little lengthy, but it's honoring your experience, it's honoring my experience, and it's saying with compassion what I need.
Absolutely.
Yeah, I love
and it brings back that expectation setting piece. And I think that is such a huge element of communication as a whole that we as humans kind of lose sight of it a lot of times. Is the fact that we all want consistency, predictability. We want to know what's next. I mean, that's just how the natural brain works. But then you add in the layers of if you've had trauma in your past, and it's just tenfold more intense in terms of that need. So being able to communicate the expectation of I need XYZ and I need to, because of that need, we need to kind of discuss this topic here in order to achieve this element of our relationship.
Yeah, it can be a conversation.
Yeah.
In the spirit of conversation, what does the other side look like? So somebody you care about says, because this is where I struggle, and I tell Lindsay this a lot, that sometimes I forget how to people. And it's like my brain just short circuits and I'm like, I don't know what to do. Like you very kindly and very clearly laid out this thing for me, and now I'm holding it in my hand and I have no idea what to do next.
Like when you're receiving someone's boundary.
Yeah.
Yep, I get it. Because there's no doubt that sometimes someone's boundary means you're going to get less of them, or you're going to have more space or time or distance or whatever. And then when we love someone or care about someone, that can be painful.
Yeah.
I think it's a both and. Like, I think you can simultaneously cognitively really understand why a person needs a boundary and honor their right to it and be like, you do you. And feel emotionally impacted when someone asks for space or distance from you.
Yeah.
I think it's a big problem. I think the biggest problem for me comes up when I judge myself for feeling a little hurt or wounded by someone's boundary, because that's really normal. Like, it's not like a solution, but rather just me too. you know?
Well, and like we're allowed to be people and we're allowed to have feelings, and they're not like in a perfect little box. What a relief.
Right. And like, it's okay. Like, there's this one quote I've heard again online that's like, sometimes, and this is another nuance, like a deeper layer now, which is that sometimes one person's boundary is incompatible with another person's need. Right. So just because if someone sets a boundary with you, you may want to honor it, but that boundary may mean that the relationship is no longer functioning in a way that feels emotionally safe for you.
That's right.
At which point you then get to decide, can I be flexible and compromise, or do I then need to set a boundary around my participation in this relationship?
Yes.
Layers.
This kind of, that's exactly why at the beginning I was talking about the seasons, right? How people come and go in our life in a season, because the more you grow and the more that you heal and you step into that whole take up space, use your voice, the more you kind of learn how to lean into that. you're going to be met with some resistance from some people, and you might cross other people's boundaries unintentionally by finding your voice. And that doesn't make you a bad person, nor does it make the person on the receiving end a bad person, because to your point, they could have a different need that now you're unable to meet. You're unable to align in that, and that's okay. And it's a matter of like really having that mindfulness of just sitting in that space and saying, whew, this is really uncomfortable, and I'm really sorry to see that we're going down this path. And it's been wonderful to know you. And it's, it just, this is what it is. And I wish you all the best. Peace and love. Gotta go. It just is what it
Yes.
is. It's not always that easy. You hope that you've got two civil adults that are willing to communicate together. But,
Yeah.
I think that's a big part of the healing journey that is not often discussed, which is how many people you might lose in the process of leveling up.
And it's so hard. Like, I think
Mm.
if I could share like a personal story real quick to
Love
that
it.
point,
Sure. Absolutely.
like maybe a year and a half ago now, I was kind of coming to terms. I was doing the thing of taking up more space and letting myself kind of honor my own limits. And there was a particular relationship in my life in which I'd very much been the listener, like the sounding board, the pseudo therapist. And I was recognizing that that was no longer working for me.
Mm.
And I had a couple talks about it with this person, and yet we never quite reached an equilibrium that felt reciprocal enough for me.
Mm.
And so I eventually had to step back. And that was so complicated. And I think we toss around the phrase like outgrowing relationships, like, blah, blah, blah. But the visceral emotional reality is so different. Like I felt such guilt.
Mm-hmm.
I felt pride. I felt self-respect. I felt shame, like the soup of emotion. Oh my God. And I remember even saying to the person then, like, I see what you're going through and I hear you, like, and this just isn't working for me anymore. And like, it wasn't even a judgment of them. It was just, again, honoring my own limits. And I'm a sensitive person. Like it was just too much for me to handle at the time.
Yeah.
And this person was very, very hurt by it. And I think it left like a real wound for them that still exists, I think. And that is a lot to sit with. Like, how do we sit with the hurt of knowing that our boundaries have hurt someone?
Yes. Oh my, that speaks to my soul as well, girl. I feel that on so many different levels. On so many different levels. I have lost a number of friends myself for the same kind of reasons over time. I actually just got divorced after 3 years of waiting. It's final.
Wow.
Yeah, hip hip hooray. But there was a lot even in the context of that relationship, of my marriage, is that, boundary setting was something that was very absent for the duration of the marriage. And the more I kept learning, my needs matter. I matter. I need to stand up for myself. I need to start using my voice. And the more I kept getting a little bit better at doing it, the more the relationship started to crumble.
Yep, this can happen. It's very real.
Absolutely. So I can feel that with my whole heart, how much of a impact that can make, and the ripple effect, no less, that it can create, and the feelings of guilt for using your voice, because wholeheartedly, even like going into it, and that person, whether it's a friendship, work colleague, whatever, when it's a boundary that's really hard for you to set, and that relationship well enough to know, man, I'm going to hurt them by setting this boundary. I'm going to hurt them by speaking my truth and being really honest with my core needs right now. And I'm going to feel the fear, and I'm going to do it anyway.
That's right.
Oh
That's
my
right.
gosh, that's hard and such a yucky feeling.
It's hard. It happens so much, right? In partnerships, I see it a lot with people and their parents, people in their family of origin. I think that's where this comes up especially potently. Yeah. Oh yeah. Same.
Right here, sister. Right here. Hardcore.
It is. And it's something that we've talked about a lot here. And Lindsay and I talk about this a lot in our like personal off-air conversations too, right? To say like, you have to sit in the crap, you have to sit in the dirt, and you have to feel the feels like do the work and then emerge from it a different person, emerge from that having learned
Yes.
something, emerge from that, you know, having grown or, you know, changed in some way. And also simultaneously hold space for the fact that like you can grieve that relationship. You can grieve that old version of you. You can
That's
Oh my God.
grieve like I look
Yeah.
back and I think about all that I have lost and all that I have gained as I've grown as a human, as I've grown as, you know, a mom, just all of it. And I'm like, I can feel an immense sense of pride and joy and just excitement about where I am. And also like in that exact same moment, be like in tears because of something I no longer have, because of a boundary I set or something I learned or something, you know, some growth aspect.
Oh, the
I feel very
suffering
moved.
part.
Yeah, like
And
can we talk about that? Like let's talk,
Yes.
we use the
Love
word
to.
grieve.
Can we dive into that? Yes.
Let's go. We're
Like
diving.
Wonderful.
right? So grief. Like grief. I think grief is boundary setting work is so often grief work because here's the
Yeah.
thing, like
Mhm.
when so many thoughts, like
Yes.
when we reach the point of setting a boundary with a person, it's often after some time has passed where we've tried to not have to set a boundary. Maybe I've asked you to meet my needs in different ways and you simply can't or won't.
Yes.
Maybe I've dreamed of a form our relationship could take, but then by the time I'm setting a boundary with you, I'm essentially saying some part of this isn't working for me. So like you said earlier in the show, Amber, like I need to remove, or I think it was Lindsay, I need to like remove myself a little bit from this.
Yeah.
And like, there's grief in that. I mean, you're letting go of like hopes, expectations, what the relationship was. It's so
The
painful.
potential.
The
Yeah,
potential.
the idea of what you thought you had and isn't there, or they cannot provide it. The hopefulness, the dreams of what if.
Yep.
There's so many layers of complex grief involved with that.
And I think the reason that many of us don't set the hard boundaries is because we don't want to feel the grief. I think it's
the
why a lot of
pain.
us stay too long in relationships that really aren't working. It's why we
Yes.
don't have the hard conversation with our parents. It's because we don't want to face that grief, understandably. So we
Yeah.
linger in the liminal space of being like, this really isn't working for me and I feel terrible, but I'm not yet at the place where I can face the grief and pull back.
Yes. And there's
Well, and
something
I'm sorry, Lindsay, go ahead.
I just want to comment on this because I really want to hold space for where you're coming from with this concept of grief, because a big part of what I talk about as a life coach is this idea that you cannot know joy without suffering. This idea that gratitude and suffering is that pathway to actually experience joy in your life. And this really does come from more of a Zen Buddhist mindset, but this idea of, and I know this is a quote, but no mud, no lotus. No mud, no lotus. You don't get the beautiful lotus that blossoms that's been sitting in the mud and looking so crappy and ugly. You don't become the lotus without the mud. And I think that's where we have to give ourselves permission to really sit in that space, sit in that mud, feel the feelings that come with that grief, allow the suffering to just be present. Don't try to fight it, just sit with it. And it is such it's so simple, yet so freaking hard that you are willing to fight it tooth and nail with every single fiber of your being. And then after you finally give in, maybe because of just sheer exhaustion at that point, or you just can't, whatever conditions in your environment have shifted, now you're just stuck in the mud. You're forced to feel that pain. You're forced to sit in it. And it's like once you come out on the other side as the lotus, it's like, man, why didn't I come up with this idea a long time ago?
Well, and yes to everything you just said,
why
like
can't
100%. And it feeds so well because as you were talking, Hailey, and as you were talking, Lindsay, like what pops in my head is this may be a Southern thing. So forgive me for anybody who's not from the South, who's not heard this, but growing up, I always remember hearing the devil you know is better than the devil you don't. So like staying in your situation, you know what to expect, you know what's going to happen. There's a comfort in like consistency, even if it's poor treatment or detrimental to your mental health and all of those things, versus this unknown of, well, if I make a change or I set a boundary or whatever, like it could be worse.
That is, I mean, it's so potent. And that's the thing. Like, I think we all have a tendency to find security in familiarity.
Yes.
And
yes, even when it's unsafe, just
Mhm.
let's highlight that piece, because I know we've talked about this a lot. I'm a trauma therapist. I don't know if I even said that to you before, Hailey.
Yeah.
But, as I think about that, is that, that familiarity breeds comfort, and we don't always recognize that just because something's familiar doesn't necessarily mean that it's safe. um,
That is such a
and
key
ooh,
distinction.
yeah, and we again, we just go with when we talk about the family of origin problems and where things started and originated and where we originally learned the patterns of what love feels like or how communication's supposed to look. It's familiar, so we keep finding that mirror in our lives and finding the things that look just like what we've always known and find ourselves in these patterns and then say, why? Why does this keep happening? Why does this keep
Why am
happening?
I here again? Why is this the same as it was before? And
Yeah,
it's like, because you haven't
right.
changed anything.
Yep.
And if nothing changes, nothing changes.
Right. Look, we are full
That
of little
saying is
cute
so
puns
funny.
today.
I
We are
know.
like,
And for that reason, like, I think this lends itself really well to the positive flip side, which is talking about cycle breaking.
yes.
Like, because we have to celebrate victories in this work, because otherwise all we'll see is all the work we have left to do. So like, really think about it. Like, if we're someone who's come from a background of this stuff, and I think of it as like comparable to the hero's journey. Like, we go through all these phases of suffering and fear and challenge and reticence to change, and then eventually we set a boundary or we leave an unhealthy relationship or whatever. I mean, that is an enormous victory, and it's breaking, for so many of us, like breaking cycles of not only our own like trauma, but also like trauma for generations.
Yes.
It's
Yes, your
such a, like,
ancestors would be proud.
right? And your future
Absolutely.
ancestors, your kiddos or your siblings' kids or whatever, like, you're also role modeling a new way of being.
Yes.
And for
Yeah.
so many of my clients, that is like the most potent incentive to do the hard thing, is the role modeling.
Beautiful. And I know this is something that definitely touches on Amber's heartstrings. She's got 2 little ones at home.
I do. And they are the biggest reason that I've made a lot of the changes that I've made for my health, like physical, mental, all of the things, and the way that I choose to organize my calendar and organize my life and, just all of the things. It's all so interconnected, because when you, like, for me, when I looked at this tiny human that like I had just spent 9 months like caring for, with doing all of the things, and I'm like, oh my God, now I'm responsible for this human, and they're in the outside world, and like they're exposed to all of the things, and they're exposed secondhand to what I allow to happen, and they're learning and creating patterns of what they're going to allow to happen. So I had this whole like existential crisis as I became a mom, where I'm like, man, this is heavy and nobody talked about it.
I can only imagine, as a non-parent, hearing that, it's so moving, because you're right. Like, there's a lot in what you say and tell your children, but there's also what you're demonstrating just by living your own life.
And I'll tell you, and I think all parents know this, those kids pay far more attention to what you do and what you are physically like exhibiting on the outside versus what you're saying to them. Like, it's mind-boggling that we can have the same conversation. I can do the same coaching, and I can like tell them exactly how something's done. I do it a different way. They see me do that, and immediately that's how they do it. And I'm like, no, that like, what?
Monkey see, monkey do.
Yes.
They are so perceptive. Absolutely. Kids are so smart, but that's exactly the point, right? Is that we learn these things at such a young age. I mean, just the first year of life actually for a human is one of the most profound, because this is when they learn attachment. This is when they learn, in essence, the foundational underpinnings of what attachment is supposed to feel like. Is it secure? Is it unsecure? Is it, am I going to be anxious? Is my mom or dad going to show up for me? Is my caregiver going to show up for me in the way that I need? So it becomes like, just every little facet. And I'm not saying this to be like, oh, parents, y'all are doomed. Like something happened horrible. And, like, oh, because
it's
like,
all fixable too. Like we can all do the work to fix the things.
or treatable. I'll say
Treatable.
treatable. You never know what the outcome's going to be, but
Yeah.
you can symptom management obviously is more of a healthcare perspective. But,
Yes.
we can all do hard things. We can all, try our best. And when we know better, do better. It doesn't matter how old you are, if you're a parent or not. It's just once you know better, do better, and try to just show up and be the best person you can be. And I think boundary setting is actually a huge point in that, is learning to honor yourself and your needs, and do the best that you can.
Yep. And trusting that every part of that journey is going to be a little different, I think. Like, something that's been coming up, I wonder if you two have experienced this in your work, but this year I had a pretty pivotal shift, which was after, about 4 to 5 years of really honing in on allowing myself to speak up, prioritizing my needs, setting these hard limits and everything. I reached a really unexpected point where I was finding myself finding so much joy and excitement in giving and being generous. Which I feel like had become like dirty words in my own mouth, just because I had a history of doing that way too much. So there was this really fascinating shift where once I learned how to set boundaries around my giving and generosity, it was like I came out the other side, and all of a sudden this thing is joyful again. And I want to show up for my friends, and I want to take my buddy to the airport at 3 a.m. because I want to care for him. And like, it was such a total mindset shift. I was like, what? But it just goes to show that, like, even if for a little while you need to be, quote, selfish, or you need to whatever, you can come out the other side and still have your like empathetic, compassionate, beautiful self,
Oh yeah. And plus I think that experience and that shift that you were feeling is like, these are my decisions. Let me choose.
There's agency.
Yes. It's like, I can choose to do this. I would be more than happy to take you to the airport at 3 a.m. What time would you like me to pick you up? But
instead of like fear-based, compulsive, like anxiety-based overgiving, as opposed to agency and autonomy. And like, I choose to do this because it aligns with my values right now.
Yes. Absolutely. Doing it whenever it's not from a place of fear, as you said, or you're feeling like you're obliged to do it. It is a game changer in your mindset and how you show up in the world. And this is why I say, I think the ripple effect is so far and wide reaching, because all of a sudden you want to pay it forward tenfold, but it's coming from a different space in your heart. And therefore it's received in that way. People can feel that energy connection, in my opinion. This is certainly not a clinical perspective here, but I do believe in the power of the contagion effect and energy and how we affect others. And I do feel that that's one of those things that can really bond people together and aid in that sense of connection.
Yeah, I agree. And it's all about the growth mindset, right? And it's all about understanding nothing is like permanent in this space. You make a boundary today, you have it for a season, and you adjust. And Lindsay, we talked about this recently, of doing reviews to say, hey, is this thing still serving me? Is this decision I made, or is this goal I set, or is this boundary I set? Like, does it still fit? What's it doing for me? How do I feel about it? And just taking the time. And Hailey, you hit on this too with your idea of like celebrating those victories. We don't do it. We move on to the next thing. We don't celebrate. We don't review. We don't like go back through. And we just like our attention span doesn't allow it, or our like the way we've been conditioned doesn't encourage it.
Self-worth.
I'm obsessed with this idea of like the boundary review and just checking in with yourself. I wrote that down because I think it's such a powerful idea, because it
Yeah.
honors the fact that we change and shift. Like how potent. I love that.
Like, hey, we are living, breathing, like changing humans. So our needs change, our boundaries change, our goals change. So I think that's the part that I wanted to make sure that, we round out our discussion, right? Because we've talked about the genesis of beginning to set boundaries and what that looks like, what that feels like, and having those real life conversations with a person and being receptive and open and holding space for all the feels, because we're going to have them. But then, like, what do you do? Like, I set this boundary. What's next?
Right. And you know what? You're allowed to change your mind.
What? I love it.
Get out of here.
Goodbye.
Spirit fingers.
This is
You're
a great
allowed to change your
reminder
mind.
for everyone who's listening and has not seen us on YouTube. You must go to the YouTube channel to actually see our facial expressions, the spirit fingers, and like all the fun stuff that we do on screen, because you really only get half the experience if you're only listening with your, headphones or whatever.
Yeah, I got to be honest, of all the podcasts I've interviewed for, the gestures on this one are just cream of the crop, like the very best. So
I
+1.
love that.
Check out
Thank you,
YouTube.
Hailey. We appreciate that. Y'all heard that. Nice little promo shout out. Thank you very much, Hailey. Go to youtube.com/@whatthefoxpodcast and click
I love
subscribe.
it.
I love it.
So I think we are kind of coming to the end, the natural end of this conversation, right? So I think, Hailey, what we like to do at the end is kind of open up a little bit of space. Is there something that you want to share specifically with our audience? Something that you want them to take away from this episode, or just, any little tidbit that you'd like to leave us with?
God, how do you pick one? I think
can pick
really
3.
just, yeah, right, exactly. The
Yeah,
top
who says it
3.
has to be one?
True. Breaking boundaries. I'd say, I really think like, I just think what I've loved most about this conversation is all the space held for humanness. And that sounds kind of far reaching and broad, but it really does feel like the biggest takeaway for me is just, it's like the both and. I'm allowed to set a boundary, and that might make me feel guilty, and you're allowed to be hurt by it, and this could benefit our relationship in the long term. And like, it doesn't need to be a zero-sum game, mutually exclusive thing, which I think that's why these long form conversations really matter, because I think on social media or other avenues, it's easy to get stuck in a black and white mentality. So hold space for all of it. I mean, that's really what I'm taking away from this.
Yes, all the things, all the things. I love that I love the way that you just synthesized all of that, because it's true. There's not just one way versus the other way. This is not a black or white process, and it's certainly not an overnight process. Something I often tell my coaching and therapy clients is just the fact that you didn't learn this stuff overnight, and you certainly cannot hold yourself accountable for unlearning and unbecoming overnight. This takes time. You have to give yourself grace, and it's not about the destination. It really is about being present in the moment, getting through one day at a time, and then just celebrating the little wins. Whenever you say, I want burrito restaurant number 1 versus burrito restaurant number 2, you say, hell yes, I did that.
I did the thing.
That. Yes. And it's okay for you to do that. Give yourself grace and honor yourself and celebrate your achievements, because over time, that is what builds our sense of self-efficacy and helping us think that we can, hey, I did it once, I can do it again. And then that builds our sense of self-confidence and self-esteem. So again, with the ripple effect, y'all. So just start somewhere. It doesn't matter where, start somewhere.
That's right. Here.
Yes. Baby steps. Those are the ones that actually like lead to stuff.
Yes, they're sustainable. Yep. Incremental. That's right.
Absolutely. I love it. Well, to everyone who is listening today, we just want to say thank you so much for tuning in. And Hailey, thank you so much for being our guest on What the Fox podcast. We want to remind all of our listeners that we are available on all of your favorite podcast platforms and YouTube. We don't really talk about YouTube that much, but we're trying to get a little bit better at that. So you guys feel free to subscribe. And also, if you like today's episode, we would love to ask you to please leave a review. Because when you leave a review on Apple, Spotify, or whatever, it actually really gives us a nice little bump so that we can get bumped in the algorithm and be given off to new listeners to find us. So thank you so much. And
Yes,
until next time.
Well, before we leave, because I know, here's one thing I know. People are going to want more information from Hailey after listening to this episode. So Hailey, do you want to share really quick how people can find you? And of course, we'll put it in the show notes too, so that they can have a reference. Don't be typing and driving, y'all. Don't do that. Don't do it.
So good. Well, after you subscribe to these folks on YouTube, you can find me on Instagram at Hailey Page Magee if you want these like daily reminders and hilarious reels. Just kidding, they're not that funny, but you can find me there. And then if you're interested in like my workshops, my group coaching, my support group, HaileyMagee.com is where that lives.
Awesome. Thank you so much.
Thank you so
This
was so fun. Thank you for having me.
Thank you, Hailey. All right, guys and dolls, we will see you next Tuesday.
See you next Tuesday.
And we all sing, everything is gonna be just fine. It's gonna fall into place. The sun is gonna set on your terrible day.